What's good? It's Obscure 8, and we're going to make 808s using analog synths. We're going to use the Moog Sirin, the Odyssey, the Korg Prologue, and we're also going to explore some techniques to make it stand out in your mix using saturation, compression, and distortion. So let's go. First off, let's start with what an 808 bass sounds like. And I'm using an 808 emulation from Jackbox. It's a Reason extension, rack extension within Reason 12. Okay, so now that we know what a basic 808 sounds like, we're going to create an 808 using the Moog Sirin. So I have a C1 note on loop that's being triggered by the DAW by Reason 12 through MIDI to the device. Now that the note is looping, we're going to start triggering our sound. We're going to take the VCO up, and then we're going to open up the filter. Now we're going to increase the decay and release. On the Moog Sirin, the decay and release is determined by this release button. By engaging the release button, you get more of a trail versus a hard cutoff when you release the note. Let me show you what I'm talking about. You see where it stops, but when I press release, it trails out. It's more of a smooth trail on the end. Now that we have an 808 sound, we're going to start carving it out. So I'm going to start playing with the envelope generators to see what kind of sound I want. I'm bringing the sustain level up. Now that I have a basic 808 sound, I'm going to start molding it using the envelope generators. On the Moog Sirin, you have a filter section for the envelope controls, and then you have a amplifier section for the envelope generator controls. Since I want more of a fuller bass sound, I'm going to bring in VCO2. And at this point, adjusting it and molding it is pretty much your taste and where you want the bass to be in terms of movement and level and punch and character. For example, this sustain level may not be where you want it to be in terms of length and time. So I'm going to bring the sustain back down, which gives it more of that traditional 808 release. But alternatively, bringing the sustain level up in this case gives it more of a bass line versus an 808 bass and release and tail on the end. As I'm experimenting with the envelope generator controls, I realize I'm going to leave them where they are because it's manipulating the sound too much. I don't want a slow attack, and I don't want any dips or bumps in the 808 as it progresses. All right, so the bass is sitting exactly where I want it. I'm loving how the 808 is sounding. Later on, we're going to bring it up in terms of dB and adjust the character with some outboard gear that I have. So let's move on to the Odyssey. All right, so now we're going to work with the Odyssey and build an 808 using the Odyssey. The faceplate for the Odyssey looks intimidating, a lot of controls, but the operation is basically the same. You have VCOs, multiple VCOs going to a filter section, going to an envelope generator control section. With this one, you have the ADSR, and then you have an AR option, which is attack and release. ADSR meaning attack, decay, sustain, release. And you just have more controls and options with the ARP Odyssey, but the basic control is similar to what you find in the Moog Sirin. We're going to work with the VCF resonance and set it to self-oscillating. Engage this keyboard CV switch so we're able to control the notes, and the note actually changes in pitch versus one note being the same throughout the whole keyboard span. I'm going to use the ADSR section versus the AR section on here because I like being able to manipulate the decay and sustain. I'm going to put the amplifier to ADSR, and I'm going to put this control to ADSR. The VCF filter modulation level controls how much the ADSR affects the filter. Let's get some sound going so you can see what I'm talking about in real time. First off, like before, I have a sound looping from the DAW, a C1 sound, triggering the ARP Odyssey through MIDI. Now that started, you're going to start to hear something. All right, so now I'm opening the filter up. Now with the VCF resonance being self-oscillating, the controls are different versus having the VCOs engaged. So you're going to have to adjust the modulation level, which is this knob right here, versus the actual filter frequency to taste, because it's going to change the pitch depending on the settings. I don't want it bouncing up and down in terms of pitch. So I'm going to have to adjust these two sections to get that. I'm looking for a straight, bold 808 note. So I'm going to keep playing with these two controls. All right, so that's where I want it. As I'm engaging this note, I'm looking at my tuner to see where the note is falling in terms of the actual note range, and I'm trying to get at about a C1 with this note. I'm using a typical guitar type tuner to get what note I want with the ARP Odyssey. If I adjust the modulation level anymore, it's going to mess with the pitch too much, and I just want it at that static C note. Let me show you what I'm talking about in real time. You see it's moving throughout the pitch range, so I'm going to keep this level down. Now that's a hard hitting 808, and that's exactly where I want the sound to sit. Right here is where I would stop with the one shot and export it, and then worry about manipulating it later and adjusting the dB later, and using outboard gear to bring it up to the level and presence I want on the final one shot. All right, so now we're going to build an 808 with the Korg Prologue. As I said before, we have a DAW trigger and a C1 note, so now we're going to engage that and start building. So with the Korg Prologue and many of these synths, the setup is pretty much the same. A VCO section, going to a mixer section, going to a filter section, and then the envelope generator controls. You have attack, decay, sustain, release. The Korg Prologue starts with the default patch, which is this. It's a simple saw wave, but we're not going to use the saw wave for our 808. On here, you have the option of a saw wave, a triangle wave, and a square wave. We're going to go into the multi-engine section on here, turn down the VCO1 and VCO2, and we're looking for a sine wave. So as we pull this up, now you can hear the sine wave being triggered by the DAW. So from here, you're carving out how you want your 808 to ring out. I just turned down these controls on the envelope generator. I'm keeping the decay short, and now I'm gonna play with the sustain and release. This shape knob, I just wanted to experiment and see what it sounds like. It kind of gives you a modulation slash resonance type feel to it. So I'm gonna leave that alone. Obviously, I want a smooth 808 sound. Drive gives it more of a saturation and mid-range bump to it, but you have to be careful and check your low end presence and your subsonic frequency to make sure you're not robbing that when you play with drive on some of these devices. But I do like how it sounds. All right, see, by taking this envelope generator knob down, we're giving it more of a kick bass type feel. All right, so let's see what bringing in a VCO would do. On the VCO I added to it, I dropped it down an octave, and I'm just looking for a slight character change on the 808. I like how the saw wave gives it a nice buzz, adds some character to it, and makes it slightly unique. All right, so I like how the 808 sounds. We're gonna leave it where it is, has tons of headroom, so we can experiment with the outboard gear later. So now we have all of the 808s that we created earlier, from the Moog to the Odyssey to the Korg Prologue. And now we're going to run through the before and after. I processed them all, and we're going to do an A and B and run through the typical process I would use and the settings and the type of equipment I would use to enhance and manipulate and shape some of these sounds and one shots. Now here's the before and after on the Moog bass. So what I did with this one is I used the Neve 542 500 series modules and the Handsome Audio Zulu module. Usually I keep the saturation and the mix percentage low when I'm using the 542s and the Handsome Audio Zulus, but with this particular case with the 808s, I used about 25% on the saturation and 25% on the mix. And then I ran it through the Handsome Audio Zulus. So with the Zulus, you have a headroom control based on the type of tape deck that you want to use. I use the Pro-Fi option on the 808s. Then on the enhance knob, that blends in the amount of tape effect versus the actual dry signal. And there's also some internal circuitry that helps create a type of sound and character to it. The bias knob is a combination, from my understanding, a combination of a filter and a compression effect. These are pretty much the settings I used. I like the Zulus because they're passive. You can be mobile with them because you don't have an active component. You don't have to plug it up into the wall or anything. They're pretty much good to go. And then they have a nice subtle character to them. You can crank it up on the lo-fi end, and you can blend in some extreme saturation. But I like the way the compression behaves on these Zulus. It's not overbearing versus the 542s, where the compression can be, for lack of a better word, kind of crunchy when you crank it up at the end. It's not as smooth as the Zulus. But I do like using both of them. It just depends on the track. It just depends on the sounds I'm using and the way I want to manipulate them. One of my favorite features about the 542s is the silk red and the silk blue texture controls. The silk blue pushes the transformer into a lower end harmonic content region, and the silk red pushes the transformer into a higher end harmonic content region. And I use the silk blue on the 808s and I pushed it to the max. Now if I'm using the 542s and the Zulus, I would keep the tape saturation down typically on the 542s and use the tape emulation on the Zulus more so. And that's what I did with the Moog bass. I dialed the settings in to taste on the Zulu, and this is what you get. All right, now let's look at the ARP Odyssey. I'm going to play the original file, and then I'm going to play the processed one. All right, so I took the original ARP 808 bass and sent it to a Moog overdrive pedal. Pedals typically used on guitars, but I use it on everything from synths to bass to whatever I feel I want to experiment with overdrive on, even vocals at times. I took the overdrive signal and then I took the original 808 signal. And then when I brought it back into the DAW, I inverted the signal of the pedal, and this is what came out. So with the 542s, I added some gain to them, and then I added some saturation just to try to glue it together, make it seem cohesive, and then give it that saturation edge and grit to it. There's a million ways to do this. There are a lot of rules people try to put into sound design and mixing, but I just say go with your gut, experiment, try something different, try to break the rules, but yet make it sound and feel natural and harmonically pleasing to you or your client base. And I like how this 808 from the ARP Odyssey came out. So we're going to move on to the Korg Prologue 808. Here's the before and after of the bass on the Korg Prologue. With the Korg Prologue bass, I sent it to the 542s, and then I sent it to DBX 166 XL gate and compressor. The settings you see on here are actually the settings I use. It's pretty congested in terms of all these cables and other racks, but you get the idea of the type of settings I used on here. Fast attack, fast release, 2-to-1 ratio, and I cranked the peak stop limiter all the way up on this one. The thing I love about the DBX 166 XL is the amount of character you can pull out of the sound just by tweaking these knobs. It's something I can't find in terms of a VST compressor to do the exact way. It's just something about hardware and actual electronics that add that, 5-10% of magic to it that the VST cannot do. With this Prologue 808, has a little bit of noise, but it's enough grit for me. I really want grit and character more so than anything. I could just crank up the gain in my DAW, but I wanted to bring the level up through hardware gear and add some of that input, that harmonic character from the hardware gear itself. So let's listen to the wet version one more time. Now, if you don't like the amount of noise on the high-end region, then you can always use a low-pass filter and filter it out. And let me show you an example of that. Just find out the frequencies that are screaming the most, the frequency band, and then use your filter to knock out that particular band. So here's an example, a technique of isolating the problem area, the area that you don't want. Bump up the gain on that EQ region and then use the frequency to sweep and find out the exact, the harshest area of that region. So I'm gonna pull up the spectrum analyzer, take the low pass filter, and just sweep out that extra noise on the upper end. And in this case, you still have a nice 808 boom with a sizzle in the mid-range. But it's all about your particular taste level and the mix you're working in. These are the typical techniques I use to sculpt my 808s, to sculpt my bass, and just overall one-shots. It's all taste level. It depends on what you want, the type of mix you're using. As always, experiment, try what works out best, test your mix on subs, other speakers, and just to see if it's harmonically pleasing to you, and do your thing, man. Always push the limits, and I hope this was very helpful to you. If it was, like, share, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you want to see next, and we'll see you on the next one.